with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in. As always, today I have a good friend, Dr. Matthew Sowcik. He has been teaching for over 20 years. He's currently an assistant professor of leadership development at the University of Florida. Dr. Matt serves as a faculty member for the Challenge 2050 project, a program aimed at developing human capacity and leadership to meet the challenges of a growing population. Originally from Wilkes-Barre, PA, Dr. Sowcik earned his Bachelor of Arts at Wilkes University, majoring in psychology and business, his Master of Arts is in organizational leadership from Columbia University. He followed up with that, getting his doctorate in leadership studies from Gonzaga, another fellow Jesuit institution. Dr. Sowcik focuses research on humility and the creation of organizational leadership programs. He also teaches both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And he is focused on interpersonal leadership development, organizational leadership, and advanced leadership theory. Outside of his research and teaching, Sowcik serves as a consultant to the New York Times, where he focuses on the newspaper's educational programming for faculty and students within leadership studies. He has been awarded with the Wilkes-Barre Presenter of the Year Award. He has won SAGE's Outstanding Leadership Scholar of the Year in 2019 through the Association of Leadership Educators. He has been Teacher of the Year, and he is just an all-around great guy. And I'm excited to catch up with you today, Matt, and have a conversation and hear what you've been up to. But before we do that, what else do listeners need to know about you?
It's always nice to have a really big introduction like that, where especially when you end with awards and then we jump right into how I talk about humility. That's always a really good connection in that process. So I appreciate that. That was so nice. I should have you follow around and kind of announce me when I walk into rooms. The one thing you missed, the one thing that's really important to me, probably the most important to me, is I'm a father. I mean, that's really the most important, job role that I have. I have two wonderful kids. I kind of always tell the story when I get started introducing myself, whether it's at a presentation. I have these two kids who are just amazing. They're wonderful. They're now 12 and 10. I can't even believe that they're that old. They're going to be celebrating their birthday next month. Carter is the older one. He's kind and sweet. And if he did anything wrong, he tricked me into believing that raising children was really easy. So we had Chase. And Chase is amazing too, but every gray hair on my head in that process. And when I introduce myself, I always say the two things that I had to do, and you know this, two things you take on different roles. The two things I had to do is the birds and bees talk. When they turn 45, I can't wait to give that to them. That's going to be great. And the second thing was this idea of potty training. And so when they turn 3, and maybe you feel the same way I do, I kind of go into this research mode whenever I have to solve a problem. So I'm reading and I'm listening to whether it's podcasts or looking online. And when Carter turned 3, what I heard, what the theme was over and over is you toss a couple Cheerios into a into the bowl and you line them up. And I did my best Tony Robbins speech and I made him walk across coals and I lined him up and he delivered. And I couldn't be more proud in that moment, kind of pounding my chest, earning my, number one dad mug. And
Nice.
when Chase turned 3, the same thing. Like I went after it. Same Tony Robbins speech, same walk across coals. I threw them in there and Chase lined up. And then he reached in and he ate them. And I thought, like, what the? So it's this idea of like human behavior. I can't wait to talk to you today about that. So I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, all those good things.
Awesome. Well, I need to have an expert on. Yes, family, right? I think even through the pandemic, it was a leadership challenge for my wife and I. We were a team. How do you work together how do you lead your children and influence your children? Yes, the potty training. And, I've never told this story in the podcast, but when it was time for us to have our children no longer use the, oh my gosh, what are those things called when they are
like a binky or something?
Yeah, like a binky. When it was time to get rid of the binky, that's what we'll call it, because I can't literally think of the name of it. We said to our daughters, hey, here's how this works. We go to the zoo and we give your binkies to the elephants. And that's what we do. They take them when you turn 2. And they were like, really? And we were like, yep. So maybe this is not the best parenting because we are kind of lying to our children, but we said, look, they need them. Actually, it was the monkeys. When we started off, it was the monkeys. So my wife and I are driving to the zoo. It's the big day. It's arrived, and we're the girls are feeling a little anxious about getting rid of their binkies. Their pacifiers is the word I was looking for.
Pacifier, yes.
And yes. And so we kind of built it up. You're going to give them to the monkeys. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. My wife and I are having this kind of challenging day. We're kind of going back and forth with one another. We get to the zoo, we get to the monkeys, and there isn't a monkey in the cage. And we built this up for our daughters. Where are the monkeys? And so my wife looks at me and she goes, elephants need them too. And so we marched over to the elephants and we left them on a little curb. And then we said goodbye and we waved to the binkies. And so you just reminded me of that story. And we then went to some store and got big girl pillows and blankets, and it was a day. So, but you reminded me of that story. But that's not what we're talking about today. But it's a leadership challenge, right? Influencing and
I think what we are going to talk about is that idea of humility, and they're all humbling moments when you hit that. You build it up, and then your wife looks at you, and you look at her, and you're like, oh man, where do we go? And that's that humbling moment that you have. That parenting can, like everything else, can humble you pretty quickly.
Yes. Well, let's go there. So tell me about your latest efforts, your latest work. I'm excited to learn more.
Yeah. Very similar to you, found some passion in a particular subject area. And over the last decade, kind of put my time and energy into talking about it and researching it and finding people's stories and talking to people who knew far more than I did about it. And decided to write this book called The H Factor. And it really talks about humility and how important humility is in leadership and how so often it's overlooked. It's overlooked in our leadership education programs. It's overlooked in our organizational programs. And then it isn't practiced. And we're shocked when it's not practiced. And the book really goes into kind of the why humility is important, why it's not practiced, who needs humility. And then ultimately, there's this, how do we develop humility and how can we put that back into leadership programs?
So talk about that. So this is a topic I've never, obviously I intuitively understand the concept, but take us into some things that you learned about the topic that kind of stood out for you, because I don't even know that I've ever really seen an academic paper on the topic, but I'm sure it's a whole universe. Is that accurate?
I think people tend to stay away from it. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. I think where I came from or how I got here is I was originally reading Jim Collins' book many, many years ago. And he comes out and talks about that level 5 leader. And the book has sold 4 million copies. It's wildly successful. It's on every manager's, bookshelf, proudly displayed there. And he talks about this idea of humility and determination as being the two key pieces that really great leaders have. Yet you don't see it often, and you don't hear people talk about humility a lot. And there's a story that goes into in why I call it the H factor, but this idea of, I was watching the X Factor show with my stepdaughter, and this young singer came up and he sang in Spanish, and it was beautiful and it was amazing. But then he came up and talked to the judges, and he was really chauvinistic. I mean, he was just like, "Hey, woman, what'd you think?" sort of thing. And at that point in time, I think it was like Demi Lovato or somebody who said, "Geez, you know what's even sexier than singing in Spanish is humility. I can't believe it." And he just kept going, and he kept whacking at these judges. And I thought, like, geez, that's really important. This idea of humility becomes really important, even if technically you can sing really well. But then out of the blue, all four judges give him a yes and move him on. And it was like this shocking moment of like, wow. But it's not. Like, technically, we care so much more about what someone can do in the moment than that idea of humility, that idea of character. And the reason it resonated so much with me was my daughter was sitting there and didn't even face her. And I thought at that moment, and it was kind of the moment with social media, and it's where we've gotten to now, and definitely something that I think you've seen, where we really lack some humility in how we present ourselves. We lack humility in how we present leadership to some degree. The reason why, and in Colin's book, he actually suggests that the X factor isn't personality, it's humility. And that's kind of where this topic comes from. But the reason we don't is, if you think about our leadership education, if you think about our leadership theory, if you think about us practicing leadership, it's very Western based. It's very US centric. I mean, that's not something that, I'm telling you that you don't know. And out of that comes this individualistic, you can do it on your own. You don't need other people. There's this thought that, we have to put perfection out there, that we only evaluate leaders if they win a certain amount of games, or they get reelected, or if they make enough money for the shareholders within a very limited point of time in that process. And that becomes really troublesome for humility, because humility suggests that we're looking long-term, that we're understanding that everyone's connected, that we have a bigger purpose. And it's not just in those 10 wins or getting elected. So I think America is set up not to promote humility as being kind of that core value. And then I think our business schools, and we wrote a paper not too long ago. It's been a couple of years now, but we talk about business schools and their mission for leadership. Yet 16% higher narcissism rates in business schools than any other school in universities. And you start talking about what type of people are coming in, and if we don't train them to be humble, that becomes really troublesome in this process.
What does the research say on humility? I mean, what academic work has been done? I kind of haven't seen anything, but what stood out for you?
What I loved about the topic was, so once you start to explore it, and I had not seen much on it other than Colin's stuff. So the more I kind of looked into it, and the book really kind of goes into this, it's an amazing piece. And I know when you write about emotional intelligence, there's some similarities in that. And I would argue that Goleman and Mayer and Salve, they set the stage for Brene Brown to talk about vulnerability and be okay with that. And now I think we're at the point where we can start to talk about humility as being something that really resonates in our culture, in our organizations. And I found that. So in the book, and throughout the process, I had some wonderful interviews. One of those was Laszlo Bock, who used to be the vice president of Google. And he talked a lot about this idea of when he first got to Google in the 90s, they used to do those really crazy questions. Maybe you've seen the movie The Internship with Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson.
Yep.
And they're getting interviewed in the movie, and they ask, if you're shrunk to the size of a nickel and you're trying to jump out of a blender, how do you do it? And they're brilliant. They say, we wait for it to break, and then we jump out, and we're these tiny humans that save the world. And all the Google people are like, oh my God, I don't know what to do with this. But those were really true questions. That was a question. How many manhole covers were in New York City was an interview question. It's 10 times harder to get into Google than it is Harvard. They got really smart people, and their belief was that if we asked really crazy questions and shook them up at that moment, we could find out who had who had the guts or who had the whatever to be able to make it here. And what Laszlo found was there was absolutely zero relationship, no correlation between those questions and the success at Google. So he completely changed it, and he started to ask humility-based questions. And he changed the culture to really focus on humility. And Google has been practicing that for about 10 years now. And you find Zappos has it in their values, and Kellogg Company, and Worldwide Technology, and Teach for America. All these companies are starting to embrace this. So practically, you start to see humility in there. And then the research starts to pile in. So over the last decade, there's wonderful researchers out there who are talking about humility having this wonderful relationship, correlation with all of these pro-social characteristics like perception and diversity and creativity. Emotional intelligence and humility are connected, as you would imagine. Engagement, fairness, forgiveness, generosity, intuition, performance. Not only performance and how well people perform, but focus on performance in this process. And then things like teamwork and systems thinking and well-being are all now being connected to humility. And then you start taking it one step farther and you start thinking, is there some common sense around this? And it really is true. I mean, if you think about all the world's religions, the one core feature they have is humility. And you start thinking about great leaders, and you think about Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. There's books and books and books that talk about humility as being their core characteristic. And it really resonated with me more recently when I started to look into those thought leaders who would be kind of out there writing books. So Simon Sinek and Dale Carnegie and Warren Bennis and Stephen Covey and Malcolm Gladwell, they all talk about humility, not as a book, but at some point in their books, they talk about this. So where it really resonated with me was there is very few characteristics that Google and Moses and Dale Carnegie and Ben Franklin all would suggest in leadership are important, and that research would back up. And it tends to be humility in that process. So there's just wonderful research. And I think where it goes is this idea that we look at ourselves, and then we look at the importance of others, and then we look at the overall purpose, and that kind of gets us to humility.
How are you defining humility? Is there a definition that you use?
That's probably the best question I get, because like most of the time, people don't study humility because of maybe even like a branding issue to some degree. We see humility as being like less than or lower than. And from a leadership perspective, people don't love that. I mean, they don't love that at all. So when I looked at a lot of the research that came out, and once again, there's these wonderful researchers who are putting a lot of time and energy into this, kind of the common theme throughout all of it is this idea of having a proper perspective. So not, an accurate or a perfect perspective, but just this proper perspective of ourselves. So understanding who we are, a proper perspective of others, and then a proper perspective of the larger environment, our overall purpose, the bigger piece to that, kind of that systems piece to that. And when I talk about that in this book, we have to start with, and it's almost counterintuitive, but we start with yourself, and you start to understand that we are imperfect, incomplete, impermanent. And that's something we just don't practice at all in leadership. And if I have one argument, and I think we have joked before about books that you would write about all the crazy, theories or things that people say about leadership, but it really is true.
Yeah.
And moreover, like if you just go on LinkedIn for one day and look at the one sentence quotes that people post, they're insane. Like they're insane. I saw one yesterday when I was thinking about doing the podcast, and it said, leaders return their shopping carts. If you're too big to do the small things, you're too small to do the big things. And you can look this up. I mean, it's plastered everywhere. I will tell you, there is no research that supports that if you don't take your shopping cart up, you're not going to be a good leader. And I've done the research about shopping carts in a parking lot. The only thing it suggests, and I did hours of research to find this out, is that if the more shopping carts that are in a parking lot, the more likely people are to drop trash. That is the only research that's out there. There's just no, but we present And everyone presents this idea of leadership as needing to be perfect. And Beth Kempton, in this book called Wabi Sabi, she does this wonderful job of suggesting the biggest problem we have in maybe leadership right now is these folks who come out and say, you know, I used to be screwed up. I used to not be perfect, but I learned the secret to being perfect. So if you take my training or my workshop, or if you read my book, you'll be perfect too. Yeah. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's what we battle every day as researchers, as people who are pushing a really complex human behavior subject of leadership. So in the book, I talk a lot about like imperfections. Wonderful. Like it leads to this idea of growth, and it leads to this idea of failure, and it leads to all these pieces. And then I talk about being incomplete, and up until the moment you take your last breath, being incomplete in that process. There's going to be like, I think it was like 580,000 centenarians, people over the age of 100 in the next 5 years. So if you're going to live to be 100, I'm 44 now, like I've only downloaded 44% of my life. If I was looking at my computer, you just got a new computer. If I'm looking at my computer and I'm only at 44%, I'm like, oh my God, this is going to take forever. But yet once we turn 40, we're like, I know everything, shopping carts and leadership. So I talk a lot about that in the beginning with this idea of being incomplete, imperfect, impermanent. And then once we can embrace that, we can embrace what we're really good at, some of our flaws, and then it gets to the point of having a proper perspective of others. How do we connect with others? And someone I'm sure you know, Edgar Schein, talked a lot about humble leadership. And I had a chance to interview him, and he just does an amazing job of talking about the relationships that we don't have and how we only have those transactional relationships. And really, we need this caring relationship that kind of, we understand the importance of others, others understand the importance of us, and we stop treating people as a means to an end, our end, but in fact, that we are a means to other people, or a means to the bigger organization or purpose or causes end. And then the final piece is really understanding that transcendence and connecting to something bigger, and whether that's spirituality, and I talk a little bit about that, whether it's nature, whether it's the planet, or whether it's our purpose, that's really where we need to get to. And that purpose has to be bigger than just self-serving. And I think Simon Sinek and others talk about that a lot. But when we're humble, when we're truly humble, that proper perspective of self leads to a proper perspective of others, which leads to that proper perspective of something bigger.
We have my head going in a bunch of different directions. I never would have defined it that way. And that's something I just love about the process of this podcast, is that if you would have asked me in March 2020, hey, Scott, do you know a lot about leadership? I would have said, yes, of course. But week after week after week, as I'm talking with people like you from around the world with different perspectives, different areas of expertise, I'm just having my behind kicked. There's so much. And it's really brought into perspective for me how little I do know. And so I love that framing and that phrasing, because I'm kind of living it on a weekly basis as I'm talking with individuals on any number of different topics. And I also, for some reason, my mind went to like, adult development theory. So if you go to like Keegan, do I need to be a avenue I would love to just kind of go down with this conversation is, does an individual's developmental level correlate with their level of humility? Because if I'm someone who's at a stage 2 and kind of that imperial stage in Keegan's theory of adult development, that's my level of mental complexity. Humility may not be on my radar as much as if I'm that level 4 who is seeing the larger picture and better understanding their own limitations. I just finished this book by Ray Dalio, incredible book, Principles for the Changing World Order. And he has just done this incredible research. Talk about exploring the context that we're living in. This guy is just incredible at doing that. Yeah. But throughout, he's communicating it with a level of humility. This is imperfect. This is not complete. I've triangulated this with the world's best scholars and the world's best practitioners, but this is a work in progress. This is my best thinking as of now. And I think it's disarming, and it's comforting in some ways when you're in the presence of someone that is not, presenting as if they've figured out the magic bullet. That doesn't exist.
You're 100% right. And I think the research supports this idea of older individuals tend to be much more humble than youngers. And if you think about when you were 20 and what you believed you knew everything. And then when you get to be older, you believe you don't know anything in that process. So I think from a research standpoint, developmentally, there's things that happens. But if we just look practically at pieces, Benjamin Franklin was a really great example of this. He kind of growing up had a tremendous amount of misfortunes, failed businesses, to a point where he got to this place where he was like, I got to be a better person. So he came up with these 11 different characteristics he was going to work on. And they're, as you can imagine, kind of normal ones. So he presented them to a friend, and a friend said, like, Ben, you're never going to be able to do this. You're an idiot. You're just never going to, that kind of friendship that everyone has. Yeah. And then he said, why don't you throw humility on there? Ha, ha, ha. And he did. And then every day worked on just this, to this point where he kind of developed it over his lifetime in that process. And there's a tremendous amount of kind of conversation out there around, whether he was at meetings or engaging with people, he would at first try to win. Like, he would win arguments. He was smart enough to win, but he would never change people's mind because they were so put off by it, to the point where he had to learn humility and being able to give into the other side, because if he was able to do that, people were willing to listen to him, and he was changing people's minds in that process. So it was that disarming of his, like, he was smart enough to blow people away, but it never worked. And I think that's what you're talking about. I think with humility, it's a really important point to say, when we get to this point of proper perspective, we often see like arrogance and overconfidence as being the opposite of humility. So arrogance, overconfidence, let's just take overconfidence. Overconfidence is the opposite of humility. And I think that's the biggest mistake we make about humility, because the opposite of overconfidence, and you don't want to be overconfident in leadership, but the opposite of that is like, lacking complete confidence and not being good. So nobody wants that either. What I talk about with humility in the book is it's like that sweet spot. Aristotle called it the golden mean. There's a lot of people who've talked about it, but what humility does is it gives that proper perspective that we are not lacking of confidence, but we're not overconfident. We're like the perfect amount of confidence on a spectrum in that process. And that's what our humility does. You are no more humble if you say, gosh, I have nothing and I'm no good. And I'm sure the author didn't say, I have no idea what I'm doing and don't read this book and I'm an idiot. No, I mean, he had the perfect amount of humility to say, I'm confident, but I'm not overconfident in the person. And I just got off a podcast a couple of days ago, and they asked me who I would, have dinner with. And one of the people, which I'm sure is on a lot of people's list, is this Einstein. And the reason I would love to have dinner with Einstein is he was one of the most humble people in the world. He would consistently say, like, everything I've done is nothing compared to the universe. Like, I know nothing. And all I'm trying to do is know a little bit more in that process. And that's what kind of propelled him. The final story with this is Steve Jobs is a really good example of someone the first time around who had no humility at all. And he was fired and crushed to some degree. And during that period of time, between the first time he served as Apple's president and CEO to the second time in that process, he found his biological mother. He went and had a lot of coaching and engagements. And when he came around the second time, he was still narcissistic, but he had humility to match with that. So he had people who were saying to him, Steve, we need to listen to these people. And he would listen the second time around. Yeah. Bradley Owens from BYU did this amazing study where he looked at narcissists and compared them. And narcissists, there's some good traits in narcissism, a lot of bad traits, but there's some good, really confident, really engaged, know what they're doing, are great speakers. And what he found is that the kind of counterbalancing element that separated really poor leaders who were narcissistic compared to narcissism that works to some degree was this idea of humility, that they had someone that gave them feedback, that talked to them, that they could engage with. So it really is that kind of sweet spot in the middle that counterbalances the things on extremes.
Yeah. Go on a thought experiment with me. When is it not advantageous to display humility? What do you think?
there's this idea that I believe if we're really going to get to a place where we can solve complex problems, it's going to be really important for us. When it's not good is in the current world we're living in now. And I was doing a training, and I'm sure you know this moment. You're doing a training and you're engaged and you're giving your research and you're like, things are flowing and it's great. And I had this gentleman from India raise his hand and he said, I came in humble and everyone in my organization said, you're too humble. You need to be more cutthroat. You need to go after people. You are getting walked all over in this culture. And the truth is, whether we look at women leaders who naturally have humility, a lot of research suggests women have more humility than men in their practice, or you look at individuals who are coming from a more Eastern culture, bringing in humility, they really have difficulty in our culture, in our organizations, who promote this idea of siloing and cutthroat and don't share answers and you need to do whatever you have to do to get ahead. So we need a shift so that we can embrace it. But at this point, we're not at it. And it's really hard for folks who try to practice it.
Yeah. I mean, I have to imagine there's times where the person next to you is going to promote themselves, is going to not have that realistic perspective of self, but yet they still advance.
Well, right? I mean, look at our world around us. Look at our politicians. Look at our coaches. Look at our business leaders. And it's funny, the short-sightedness we have. So people like Lee Iacocca or even Jack Welch to some degree, is when they take over, they're like in that short period of time are amazing, but then they leave an organization that just falls apart and doesn't do as well as it should. And we don't think of that as being part of them. As soon as a coach is done after winning the Super Bowl, that's their legacy. It's not what they turned over or how the next person moved forward. Bruce Arians, who's down here in Tampa, won the Super Bowl not too long ago, and he was going to stay on for another year, and mostly it was because Tom Brady was retiring, and Tom Brady comes back, and then Bruce Arians, he leaves. And a lot of the news down here in Florida is this idea is, he must have not liked Tom Brady. And he just came out recently and said, I could never leave my assistant coach with the quarterbacks we have now. So that's why I was staying. But because Tom's coming back, it's the perfect time to leave. The organization's in great hands. Who does that? Who doesn't say, boy, I'd love to take one more round with Tom Brady in this process or whatever? And that's, from a leadership perspective, thinking about that future, it's just so humbling in that process. So I think that's some of that point where we really need to understand, how do we shift the culture and how do we start to look at leadership differently, not charismatic, not short-sighted, but really bigger in that process now that we've evolved.
Well, I think you said something in there that really resonated for me. Is just that shift, right? Moving away from that quote unquote great man, that alpha. And of course there may be a time and a place, and there may be situations where someone does need to assert themselves and display more alpha characteristics. And can they also switch gears back into not that? And I think so it's just a fascinating conversation. As we begin to wind down, Matt, is there another kind of nugget that you would like to entice listeners with that kind of stood out for you as you explored this topic? Just something that just kind of hit you hard. You were like, wow. Was there a moment that occurred for you that you want to share with listeners?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I really loved is, so I'm a teacher first. I love teaching. I know you love teaching. I'm not sure how you run your class exactly, but when students walk into my class, like, I love that moment. I love building that environment. How's your day? And every single one, and then I do that every single class in that process is just like completely engage people as soon as they walk in, and then throughout the whole practice. And it's worked really, really well for me. I never knew why. I mean, it was something that you did. And then you start to read about this idea of social contagion. And we just had the pandemic, so a different kind of contagion in this. But this idea of social contagion suggests, it suggests that we are tremendously impacted by the people we hang out with. and the people they hang out with and that. So we're more likely to be happy based on the happiness of others. And we're more likely to be obese based on the obesity of others. And we're more likely, and there's just so much research and just wonderful studies on this, but smoking is included in that. And not too long ago, once again, this Bradley Owens from BYU did some research into the idea of, would this apply to humility? And it does. The more likely you are to be humble, the more likely others around you are to be humble. So if you're going to build a culture or you're going to build a team, your humility and their humility depends on it. And it's not just 1 degree of separation. You always talk about the 7 degrees from Kevin Bacon, but all of the research suggests it's 3 degrees. So your boss has an impact on your kids, or your boss has an impact on your wife. And you start to think that way. And it's like, am I impacting the people I love most because of the environment that I'm in? And I think if we knew that more, we would practice more happiness and humility engagement. It would really matter. And we would start to pick the places we work at and the teams we're on and the community we build around us, because nobody wants to be a smoker and nobody wants to be obese. But no one should want to be and put arrogance into their family. So I found that, and that was just overwhelming to me of this. If we're going to build great organizational cultures, if we're going to build a great America, and we don't talk enough about this, and this is probably a whole nother podcast. We talk about the individual leader, but we talk about world leaders. Like, what type of leader are we as America? And do we, if we really thought about it, would we work for a boss who was like America? And maybe we would, and maybe we wouldn't. But if we talk about it on a leader role that way, do we have the humility that we would want the leadership to have? And then how do we build that into our culture? Because boy, I think whether it's gas prices or wearing a mask, and I come from Florida, so wow, we could talk about that forever. But the divide that is us at this point in time needs a great deal of that sweet spot or humility to have conversations around.
Yeah, I love that. Would you work for America?
Yeah, would you work for America? Would you work for America? That's exactly right.
What's the good, bad, and ugly of that?
Yeah.
Well, this whole conversation has reminded me of a quote from our mutual friend, Tony Middlebrooks. And when he was on the podcast, you were kind of talking about setting the tone for a class and how do you walk into that space. And what he says to his students is, I don't know better, I know different. And I think for me that at least based on my limited understanding of this topic, I think it doesn't devalue what he knows. He knows a lot, but he knows different. And together we're going to explore, and together we're going to investigate, and together we're going to try and better understand this topic. And I think for me, at least, I have students listen to a podcast that I did with him, and they just that just resonates, like post after post, comment after comment. Students love that spirit because I think it enters the space in just this
contagious
way. Right?
Yeah, it's just contagious.
To your point, right?
Yeah. Hey, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Tony, where does he work?
Oh, that's right. University of Florida. Little school in the south of the United States.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Go Gators.
They're coming up. They're making a go of it, right? Yeah.
We have a lot of promise. That's right.
A lot of promise. Okay. Last question, sir.
Please.
What are you listening to? What are you streaming? What's caught your attention in recent weeks? It could have something to do with leadership. It could have nothing to do with leadership, but what's caught your eye?
Yeah. And I hope that you will confirm this. Writing a book is one of those labors of love, and you get into it and there's deadlines and you're just stressed and you're giving everything. And by the end of it, you're like, oh, I'm never going to talk about this topic again in my life. I think for the last couple of weeks, I have still loved this and still been engaged with this. I'm trying to find more pieces from a practical sense. So doing a lot of reading around the idea of humility, but from other areas. So Beth Kempton is one of those that I talked about. Wabi Sabi is the book from a cultural perspective, talking about the perfection of imperfection. But then also trying to find ways to tune out, and I'm trying to catch up on things like Ozark, which I really liked, and some others. I had to put all of those away and on the shelf during this process. So now it's a lot of kind of binge watching and trying to watch this and that, and enjoying my summer to some degree.
Well, we could watch Ozark through the lens of humility. That would be an interesting one.
That sure would. It sure would.
Well, sir, I may see you in a couple weeks, and I'm looking forward to that in Kansas City, and I will look forward to catching up. I really, really appreciate your time today.
Oh, man, this was great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes. And I will put resources into the show notes so listeners, you can tap in, you can connect to the work that Matt is doing and really investigate this topic a little bit further. I think it's a fascinating one. I love that definition. That's going to stick with me. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much, sir.
I am really excited for my friend Matt, and I think this is a wonderful topic to explore. I think each one of us have to have humility on our radar as we engage in these roles, as we take on and assume leadership. And I think the definition is really just something I love, a proper perspective of oneself, one's relationship with others, and one's connection to something bigger. Something I have just really enjoyed about this podcast is when things just kind of stick. And there's just been so many episodes where someone says something or defines something or phrases something in a way that just really, really sticks out for me. Whether that's Chip Shoba saying, this is a mountain with no top, or that is Doug Lindsay kind of suggesting Bob Hogan's quote of who you are is how you lead. There have just been so many things like that that really stick out for me. And this definition is another thing, a proper perspective of oneself, one's relationship with others, and one's connection to something bigger. As always, thank you so much for checking in. Thank you for listening. Share this with others if you find it of value. And as always, be well. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.